of course, acknowledge the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territories the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So I won't say too much other than I'm really looking forward to hearing from all three of you. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. I know I've been reviewing papers, and reviews of activity are always a ton of work to do. And if somebody's been messing with models for a long time, I'm really happy to see somebody's actually put the work in. And I think, Katya, you're going to kick us off.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity and for joining us today. So my name is Dr. Katya Rhodes, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration and a member of the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems at UVic. For those of you who don't know me, I do non-engineering social science work in the area of low carbon economy transitions and climate policy designs. And for that, I rely on survey tools and energy economy models. So today I'm joined by my graduate research assistants, Hoyle and Kira Craig. We will present the results of our SSHRC-funded comparative review of 24 energy economy models used in Canada in the last 10 years in the hopes of improving climate policy projections and helping policymakers choose the most suitable models for answering their policy questions. So this is a collaborative effort between the University of Victoria and ECCC. So I would like to thank our research collaborators, Dr. Madeleine McPherson, who can't make this seminar today. She is a member of the Institute as well, and Glasha Obrecht, who leads Canada's climate policy projections in ECCC. So Aaron is no longer a research assistant. Aaron is no longer a student. He is an analyst in the Canada Energy Regulator, working actually with Dr. McPherson's model that she invented during her PhD. And so he now uses it to produce energy futures reports. So if you have any questions about those reports, Aaron is there to be contacted. Aaron has a master's degree in resource and environmental management from SFU. And in his thesis, he studied the effectiveness of Canada's announced clean fuel standard using an energy economy model called GTEC. And Kira is still a master's student in the School of Public Administration, but soon she hopes to graduate at UVic. And so this project is her thesis. She led the survey component of the project to study differences and similarities across models in Canada. So with that, thank you for the acknowledgement, Andrew. So I'm not going to do that, but I'll just mention that Aaron is located in Alberta on the Treaty of Seven Nations and the Métis Nation of Alberta. So he's in a different location. That's why we acknowledge in different lands. With that, Kira, please feel free to start the presentation.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Katya. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background on our research. So energy economy models are important tools that are used to inform climate policy. However, the forecasted impacts determined by different models can produce results that vary dramatically in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and economic outcomes. Many models that have been used across the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors to inform climate policy, but their model methodology and assumptions are often not publicly available, or this information is inconsistently gathered and scattered across these sectors. In addition, these sources do not use consistent characteristics to compare and contrast models, making it difficult for policymakers and researchers to understand which model is best suited to specific policy questions. Understanding how different models understanding how different models perform against common assessment characteristics can help policymakers and researchers choose the most suitable modeling tools, which can lead to more effective findings and policy decisions and help governments close gaps to current targets. So I'm just going to start with a brief outline of our presentation today. So first, I'm going to discuss the research goals of the study. Then provide a brief overview of our methods and the models that we found to be used in Canada over the past decade. Then Aaron and I will introduce the key assessment characteristics that we determined are important to predicting greenhouse gas and economic impacts of climate policies, and summarize the results of our research. And finally, conclude with some best practices that can be used to improve accuracy of evaluations of GHG and economic impacts of climate policies. So the overarching goal of this research is to determine what the key improvements, knowledge gaps, and critiques of models are in Canada over the past 10 years. Our first objective was to identify the key assessment criteria. Then we identified the models that have been used in Canada over the past decade and assessed them against these determined criteria. And finally, we developed best practices for modeling climate policies. So the first step in this research, we did a scoping literature review that was run by Aaron of academic and public reports using the sources such as ScienceDirect and Google Scholar. And through this review, we found 21 energy economy models that have been used in Canada over the past decade. And then we used the results of that literature review to approach 33 users and developers of these models to complete a survey to gather information that may not have been publicly available. And for that, we received responses for 17 distinct models. It was a 42% response rate. So in total, we assessed 24 distinct models using these two approaches. And as you can see on the screen, these can be categorized in 4 main categories, such as bottom-up, hybrid, top-down, and integrate assessment. And as you can see, hybrid models were the most common model type that we found. So I'm just going to turn it over to Aaron to start us off on the key assessment characteristics.
Thanks, Kira, and thanks, Katya, for your introduction. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to run through these assessment characteristics that you see on the screen. And these were determined through our lit review. And in the following slides, we go through each of these in detail, as well as the results that we found when assessing the determined models against each of these. We found pretty considerable support in the literature that these first 4 characteristics relative to the alternatives determine to a greater extent the ability of energy economy models to predict GHG and economic impacts of climate policies. On number 5, which is our uncertainty and spatial temporal data transparency characteristic. So these characteristics were not as consistently highlighted in the literature compared to the first 4. I'll also discuss that a bit more later, but we found them to be kind of not as important to the prediction of GHG and economic impacts, but we found that they still were highlighted in the literature as important criteria to explore. And so we kind of dug into those a bit further in the survey, which Kira will explain in a little bit. Okay, next slide, please. So this is our first assessment characteristic, which is treatment of technology. We define this as the level of resolution at which a model represents technological information, and also how technological dynamics are captured. And so first, we found that the majority of our reviewed models explicitly represent technologies, but that this representation ranged from tens of thousands of unique technologies, or sorry, tens to thousands of unique technologies, so quite a range. We also found that models are quite diverse in their representation of technological change. And I'll add here in particular, like there wasn't an agreement or a consensus among researchers about how best to do this. And I think intuitively that makes sense because of the complexity of representing technological change. But in practice, this means that we need to understand how representing tech change differently can lead to different results by model and kind of by objective. And a key takeaway is that when technologies are represented in adequate detail, we found that the evidence base for developing climate or energy policies is strengthened. And this is mostly because we can take pretty granular data at the technology level, like market shares or capital operating costs, and construct kind of an aggregated picture of the whole system from the bottom up. So we get kind of this top-down whole market perspective, but we also get the really granular detail that's helpful in predicting technological change. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the second assessment characteristic was microeconomic realism, and we define that as the ability of a model to realistically represent agent behavior within the energy economy. So here we found that there were two main areas of focus in the literature, which were first representing the diversity of consumer preferences. We also called that, or you can also see that being called market heterogeneity in the literature. And secondly, non-financial decision factors that are important when consumers make investment decisions. We found that market heterogeneity is commonly represented in models, but it's done so using a variety of methods again. And secondly, we found that about half of the models that we reviewed explicitly represent non-financial decision factors, and others model do so implicitly or not at all. And this is important because projections might not be realistic if they exclude non-financial costs. So this can lead to poor estimation of GHG abatement costs, and relatedly, including the diversity of consumer preferences is important in this kind of work, in particular when estimating technology adoption and also distributive impacts of policies, which is also something that policymakers are looking for. Next slide. Thanks, Kira. So our third model assessment characteristic was macroeconomic realism, which we defined as the ability of a model to represent the structural systematic relationships of a region's economy. So there's quite a lot in this characteristic. We were mostly looking for links between energy supply demand and economic output, in addition to any type of representation of interregional trade or also finance effects. And we found that most models at least somewhat represented trade effects, but much fewer represented financial and monetary features. So most models have price quantity feedbacks for energy commodities like electricity or RPPs, refined petroleum products, but only about half represent non-energy supply demand balance. And generally speaking, the models that contain these macro characteristics are top-down or hybrid models, which means that these types of models are better suited to evaluating policies that we might expect to induce large structural shifts, like shifts in output towards less carbon-intensive sectors. Things we might see given a $170 a ton carbon price. Another point is that most models recognize that it's important to capture interregional trade. But on the other hand, most models that we evaluated were not really designed to evaluate the impacts of finance or monetary policy. And we found that this was an area of weakness across the board. And the fourth model characteristic that we looked at, and the one I think that kind of ties the previous three together, was policy representation. And so here we're asking how a given model represents different types of energy and climate policies individually, but also in combination. And we found that relative to the other model characteristics, policy interaction was not often addressed by model documentation, which made it difficult relative to the others to evaluate. But more importantly, we found that the analytical approach, or the mathematical structure of a given model, dictates how policies are represented in the model, which again makes sense intuitively. Certain models are designed to represent policies better than others. We found that almost all the models we reviewed represent carbon pricing and regulations, or what we would call prescriptive regulations or command and control regulations. So those are represented quite well, but not often research and development. And one important implication from this part of the project was that the most frequent policies used by governments, or the most common at the moment used by governments in Canada, are not represented well in all models. So those were what I would call performance standards, policies like a ZEV mandate or a low carbon fuel standard. Certainly there were some models that are set up to accurately represent the credit markets in these policies, but we found that many models use potentially inaccurate proxy methods, especially at high levels of policy stringency, when that could become a problem. And Kira, I'll pass it back to you for the next slide.
Perfect. So I'm going to discuss the last three characteristics that we looked at, and these were explored further in our survey. So we explored the treatment of uncertainty, as uncertainty is an inevitable part of energy economy models due to their complexity and their incomplete representation of all real world mechanisms. So we found that all the models do use a sensitivity analysis to explore uncertainty, and over half use two or more methods, including a Monte Carlo analysis or other methods. The effect of uncertainty on a model's output can be explored through economic growth, energy prices, other parameters such as technologies and intangible costs. And we found that the most common parameters were economic growth and energy prices. So the inclusion of methods to explore parametric uncertainty, such as a sensitivity analysis or Monte Carlo analysis, help test the robustness of the results, and it provides an understanding of the influence that these individual parameters have on the final results. And so in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic, the ability to determine a range of assessments will be useful for policymakers when we are estimating our rebound back to normal. And understanding the role of uncertainty and performing these analyses can also make the results more politically acceptable. So another characteristic that is important in energy economy models is the high resolution representations of time and space. So these representations were not found in many of the models, with 24% including high resolution spatial representations and 35% including temporal representations. So the survey found that the models that do include high resolution spatial representations often use geographic blocks, and these models are often aimed at local scale policies. So these policies, such as urban planning, transportation, and zoning laws, do not equally affect GHG emissions across the region due to an uneven distribution of population density. The inclusion of high spatial representations can assist cities in developing better climate policy. And high resolution temporal representations are important for representing electricity and the renewable energy demand, and especially with the renewable energy demand, as this can fluctuate due to changing weather conditions. So our final characteristic is data transparency, and we found that most models are not freely available for public use, and they do not have open source code. And these models are generally from private companies or governments. However, most models did include open source data with inputs from public sources such as Statistics Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, or NRCan. And more than half of the models have some of their modeling equations and assumptions documented publicly. And there were some models that indicate, like some respondents that indicated that they are planning to make their model equations and assumptions publicly available. So data transparency, it affects all the previous characteristics we have just been discussing. We need to understand the assumptions to understand how the results are achieved, which is very important for public policy. And without the understanding of the assumptions, inputs, equations, the results cannot be accurately reproduced. So we're going to finish off this presentation with 6 best practice suggestions that based on our results for researchers and policymakers who are aiming to improve their climate policy projections. So models should explicitly represent technologies and technological change dynamics, and this can help models to simulate technology-specific policies. Models should aim to capture both market heterogeneity and non-financial costs. As we know, not all decision makers will make the same decisions in a given circumstance, and non-financial factors can influence technology purchasing decisions. Models should aim to link energy supply demand using price quantity adjustments to achieve equilibrium for each energy source across all sectors. They should include a representation of the trade and financial sectors because GHG emissions are heavily affected by economic activity and other macroeconomic effects. They should aim to accurately represent different types of policies while accounting for unintended policy interactions. And finally, the exploration of uncertainty allows policymakers to compare a range of assessments to make model forecasts more credible, useful, and politically acceptable. No, wrong button. Perfect. So I just like to thank everyone for listening to our presentation. We'd appreciate any comments or questions if you have them.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Kira and Aaron. That was interesting. If anybody has, you can put up your hand, or you could just let me know in the chat if you've got a question you'd like to ask. Actually, I wouldn't mind kicking off with a question. So one of the realities that seems around deciding on big energy infrastructure development. So does that get captured in any of these models? And if so, where would it be? It didn't seem in your last list there that was obvious place for something like that.
And Aaron, do you want to answer that question? And Kira, if you can open a table on macroeconomic characteristics. So we'll show an example of final matrix table, so what we call model and inventory, that we will publish in the final SSHRC report that's due in March, and also we are producing 2 publications out of this. So this like more in detail review of macroeconomic characteristics can help understand whether models are capable of assessing impact on jobs. Well, this was not like the main feature assessed in our study. I think for the most part, we can say that top-down models such as computable general equilibrium models, as well as some hybrid models that combine the features of top-down and bottom-up models, have the ability to project impacts of various climate policy scenarios on jobs in different sectors, as well as the creation of new jobs and new sectors. And that's because of the ability to represent those macroeconomic characteristics and interactions between different sectors of the economy. Aaron, would you like to add anything to this?
Nothing major, just, exactly what you said. And I think, Andrew, like what most researchers that I saw do in the lit review, at least, if they were using general equilibrium models in particular, they would just tie jobs to like sectoral growth by a, some coefficient. So really it's just, you're using sectoral growth or decreases, whatever the shifts, as a proxy for jobs. I think, new jobs is a lot, it's a different can of worms, but at least that's what I saw for the general equilibrium. And as Katya said, for like the hybrid type models, same approach.
Great, thank you.
I had a question.
Go ahead.
Nice presentation, thanks. I was wondering, does anyone do hindcasting on these models to look at actual accuracy relative to what's played out over time?
So this was not the objective of our research. While we hope that like the best practices and the inventory can help people kind of look at these tables and see what's included and what's excluded, and to choose a model based on what people think is relevant to their policy question. But in order to truly assess the accuracy of results, you would need to do either a cross-modeling exercise when you give people the same set of scenarios and assumptions to run through their models, and then meet together and compare the results, kind of what the Energy Modeling Forum does in Stanford. And that's, I think, the whole point of Dr. McPherson's energy modeling initiative in Canada, to compare different modeling results. Or you need to do backcasting for each model and compare the results. So Aaron, Kira, any other responses? No, they agree.
But has anyone actually done that or no?
Well, this has been done for years in Stanford
Yes,
on an
okay.
annual basis. Yeah. So, and based on that work, many governments have decided, especially based on my experience working in the provincial government, that models such as SIMS, now GTAC hasn't been tested through that platform, I believe, but SIMS in the past has been proven to be one of the most reliable models that produces projection results that are similar to real life data when that real life data becomes public. So yes, absolutely, this kind of exercises are done on an annual basis in the United States, but not in Canada yet.
Yeah.
So Adam, I think you're next, and then Chris.
So thanks. I had a question that comes from the perspective of an atmospheric physicist about uncertainty quantification in these models. And so it's a standard practice in weather and climate models to kind of accept that all of the models are biased, that there is not a single perfect model. And as part of the uncertainty quantification, you're not looking just at parametric sensitivity within individual models, but you're looking at variability across models. And that multi-model ensemble helps with the uncertainty quantification exercise. Are similar approaches taken in this class of models?
Aaron and Kira.
Not that I'm aware of, Adam. Like, I wish. You know, I think still, like, even seeing a Monte Carlo type parametric uncertainty analysis is kind of rare. And so I don't think that's necessarily even accepted as the status quo for individual models. So you know, we could speculate about how long or how far away that is. But I think certainly it's researchers are aware that that's a best practice or something to strive for, but I'm not sure, you know, how far off that actually is.
Right.
And there was
Sorry, go ahead.
There was a project with all the provincial and territorial governments, as well as the federal government, when I worked in the BC Climate Action Secretariat, on the best ways for measuring uncertainty in energy economy models through the Canadian Council for Ministers of Environment. And from what I remember is that most models don't even incorporate uncertainty. The best method they use is sensitivity analysis. So it's pretty rare for energy economy models to do the same kind of high quality work as most scientific natural science models do in terms of actual greenhouse gas emission science. I think the conclusion was that give decision makers a range of estimates so that when they announce a new policy, there is not just one number that gets then criticized by a variety of stakeholders. That gives them some flexibility to actually say the most minimum outcome is this and most maximum outcome is this. So it's more of a political buffer type of characteristic that's important in models for policymakers.
That's broadly similar to what's being done, say, in CMIP class climate models, right? You have a range of late 21st century warming projections, all of them based on the same greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And so that then gives you that sort of across model uncertainty, which allows you to essentially bracket your projections of what's expected.
Yeah. And in economics, when I teach this different methods for uncertainty, there is a method that basically says, look at the range of uncertainty outcomes and set targets based on that. It's even better to not set targets like at 80%. It's better to set targets at 70 to 90% of emission reductions by 2050, for example, because of that type of uncertainty across models.
Right.
Just to jump in, what you described, Adam, is one of the intended roles for the EMI, this Energy Modeling Initiative, that is to actually have this cross-model comparison exercise. I think, Chris, you're next.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Katya and team. That was fabulous study. Great to see the results of this coming out. I potentially got a ton of questions, so I'll try and keep it short. But and first, but clarification first, and you may have said this in the intro. Am I right in thinking you were just looking at models that governments are actually using? So you surveyed governments, or what is it? Is it broader than that? I wasn't sure that I caught that.
It's broader than that. It's private, public, and non-for-profit sectors. We first looked at the available academic and any grade literature available on any models that are used or developed in Canada in the last 10 years. And then we did a survey of these energy economy modelers, model developers and users to confirm and validate literature review results, and also to expand the results by adding additional assessment characteristics and identify new models that are currently not documented whatsoever in the literature. And as a result, so the first review or literature review gave us 21 models, and then we identified three additional models through the survey. And in total, we described 24 distinct model types in our report. So across all sectors of the economy.
So I guess one of my interests is in sort of the underpinnings of the economic models, which is, I'm interested. Did you pick up any of sort of like the Peter Victor macroecological economics models? Were they included in this work, or?
Yeah, so I think the first step and the first objective in this work was to identify the main assessment criteria for the models. And the assessment criteria, in a way, implicitly incorporated non-neoclassical assumptions, such as decisions about technologies are based on not just capital and operating costs, but also behavioral, intangible or non-financial costs, such as inconvenience, not the same level of service that a low carbon technology provides compared to a conventional technology, as well as the variety of decision factors that go into purchasing outcomes. So the differences between decision makers, be it consumers or producers. So from that perspective, I think you can say that we've considered other non-neoclassical assumptions, but we did not dig deeper to say that these models also take into account, how climate policy affects air quality or biodiversity. And those would be integrated assessment models that have a lot more uncertainty in their results because of those additional parameters, but we did not study them.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'll ask another question, which is related, but you probably will say you didn't look at it, but I'll try anyway. When you did look at the models with neoclassical production functions, did you pick out those that included energy as a factor? Because I know there's some models do that, and traditionally many didn't, but there's a growing trend towards doing that. Is that something you looked for in the work, or is that too much in the weeds?
What do you mean energy as a factor?
Well, you've got your typical output being based on capital and labor in a production function, in the standard production function, the solo one, and AIR's work and some OECD models have added energy as a factor of production in the functional form of those models. I'd be interested to know how commonly that's done now, or not. That would be interesting. I
think most neoclassical type models include those energy costs as operating costs. So I would say including energy is already a neoclassical kind of model. It's hard to give this label of the neoclassical model to any model because models have evolved so much, recognizing the increasing complexity in climate policy designs and climate policy mixes, as well as the importance of behavioral parameters for technology purchasing decisions, that would be difficult for me to say that there is any model on this list that is purely neoclassical.
Yeah, no, I understand that. That's a fair point. I was getting into a weeds question. Maybe I'll ask one more if I may, Andrew. I don't want to hog here, and I'll make
answer
it
quickly.
Tamara's been waiting, but if it's not long, you go for it.
Well, I asked the ones that were really interesting to me, but maybe are a little bit in the weeds, but maybe a bigger picture one. I love the fact that I love the design of the study. You came out with a list of best practices at the end. But again, experience with modeling, it's hard to build the model that does everything you want. It's really tricky. And I'm wondering if you went to that best practices page, is there and again, maybe it depends on what you're trying to do, but is there an order of priority? What's the number one thing you got to do? If you had to order the best practices, what are the top 2 or 3 that you would want to achieve? That would be my question.
So I think the best practice is that the key priority for projecting impacts of any economy-wide climate policy that affects not just one tiny subsector, but several sectors of the economy would be to be able to represent those macroeconomic interactions between sectors, so that differences in economic activity as a result of policy are considered in projections, to represent explicitly technologies and technological change, because if we are looking for deep emission reductions, some pretty substantial technological changes have to happen, and it's good to understand where they happen so that policymakers can do specific adjustments in those areas, and to represent behavior. So those microeconomic characteristics, because we know that especially consumer behavior is extremely important. And to this day, people don't treat an electric car the same as a gasoline car, the same as a bus or a bike. We know that from all neoclassical assumptions, it makes sense to take a bus to commute to work, but people don't do that for those behavioral intangible cost reasons. So I think those would be the key 3, unless Aaron and Kira disagree with me.
No, I agree with you, Katya.
Good answer.
Thank you, guys.
Tamara, you've been waiting patiently.
Hi. Yeah, I love this work. It's hard to wrap your head around these models. And I guess one really general question I had is how different, like if you're looking across, I don't know, what is it, 23 that you looked at, 24 distinct models. So how are they distinct? Like what is the scope of differences between these? How different are they?
Aaron, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. Good question. I think the integrated assessment models are quite different than the other 3. So those are, I guess, how people define them is that like they're kind of trying to represent the energy economy through pretty aggregate production functions, but then on top of that, try to represent like the atmospheric science kind of all in the same box. So I would kind of put those aside. The bottom up ones are more like engineering optimization models. And so while they may carry with them some behavioral characteristics or like non-financial cost characteristics, mostly they're like pretty simple, or the structure of them is pretty simple. They can be quite complex in terms of like how many technologies they're representing. So those are quite different than hybrid and top-down. The top-downs are the ones that are generally trying to represent like whole economy, so they'll have sectoral production functions. So it's really like the analytical framework. They're all trying to do similar things, but they're approaching it differently. And I'm seeing this. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I guess like I'm approaching this as just looking at this field itself. So if you're coming from another field, maybe they're quite different from what you're used to. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm curious, I mean, to what extent are they relying pretty much on the same data, but pretty much on the same data, let's say, but making different assumptions and ordering priority in allocation of how they treat that data?
Yeah, I think The hybrids would use similar data to both the bottom up and the top down. The top down is really using like sectoral data at a high level. And then the bottom up would be using almost exclusively technology level data for calibration and simulation, and then treating kind of like macroeconomic inputs as exogenous to the model. So like not really relying on that top down data at all. So I'd say like bottom up and top down quite different, and then hybrid by nature. So, you know, depends model to model.
Yeah, and Tamara, great question. This is what governments struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
In theory, there are data sources that are publicly available and should be used to upgrade models with. In reality, it takes about a year to upgrade a model like GTAC with a new data set, and sometimes extremely difficult programming skills that someone needs to have. For these reasons, for cost reasons and the complexity reasons, sometimes models don't get the new data inserted into them on a regular basis because it's expensive and it's time consuming. So in theory, they should be all pretty similar in terms of like especially hybrid and top-down models when they rely on sectoral economic activity data. But in reality, this is not what's happening, and there is no publicly available place that will give a realistic perception of what kind of data is included in those models. And that was the whole point of Dr. McPherson's energy modeling initiative.
Just one final question is, I study regional development in regions, distinctiveness of regions in place and scale. And, you know, when we look at a lot of economic and behavioral studies, actually regions explain so much more than even some other factors sometimes in Canada. We are just so regionally specific. So I wonder, how do these models treat regional differences in scale? Because it's hard. We don't actually have very good local data in Canada on certain things, including GDP, but yeah, how do they treat regions?
You're absolutely right. There are only a couple of models that we identified in our review that are capable of actually representing smaller type of places, such as different communities. None of the studied models can represent regions like smaller than provincial and territorial levels from the perspective of properly incorporating macroeconomic data. So I know there are attempts in the academia right now to do community level modeling studies and then to extrapolate that work to regional level. Using different sizes and archetypes of communities, but this is a pretty new field, and that requires high resolution spatial data if you want to have some pretty accurate, you know, results in terms of where to build certain kind of infrastructure. And that kind of work I think is absolutely necessary, and this is what you and I found through our study in the Vancouver Island region, that people want to see those kind of models and tools and use them in their regional work to reduce emissions. Aaron, do you think this is a good answer, or?
Yeah, no, I'm not super familiar with like the regional representation. Yeah, I was going to speculate at the provincial level, and that seems to be true. But yeah, I totally agree with you, Tamara, that like that's super important. I just don't think the data is there from what I've seen so far.
Thanks, guys. Great work.
Thank you, Tamara.
Are there any more questions? Anybody else want to have a go? I don't see anything. I think you've been well questioned. It was a good defense. Oh, sorry, this is summer. Yeah, thanks so much, Kira, Aaron, Katya. That was really interesting. And yeah, I think everybody here is probably going to really look forward to seeing these publications. It's great work.
Yeah, we'll share in March once we finish the report.
Right on. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys.